Hi everyone, Mr. Rogers here. Today we're going to be discussing identifying and drawing perpendicular and parallel lines. Alright, before we begin, I'm going to go over my standard that I'm using for this video. So in this video, I am using standard 4.G.1 that I can draw points, lines, line segments, rays, angles, right, acute, and obtuse, and perpendicular and parallel lines, and being able to identify those in two-dimensional figures. I am also referencing Eureka Math for Module 4, Lesson 3 and 4 in this video. So, if you all are ready, let's go. Alright, so some terms that you're going to need to be able to know, or terms that I'm going to be discussing in this video. If you look on my board, perpendicular lines, right angles, intersecting lines, and parallel lines. Alright, so in this video, I am going to be discussing how you identify and draw perpendicular and parallel lines. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so in a math class, we rely heavily on perpendicular and parallel lines. So perpendicular and parallel lines are the opposite of each other, obviously, but we use them both in math class. And when I was going through school, I really enjoyed perpendicular and parallel lines. That was one of my favorite math concepts that I really enjoyed, along with a few other, but today we're going to work with perpendicular and parallel lines. Alright, so you might be thinking, what are perpendicular and parallel lines? Well, you're going to get to know what those are in this video. So, if I was to draw this figure on my board, alright, what do you see in this video? Let me move so you can see it. Alright, so when I look at this, I'm going to extend this a little. Alright, so when I look at this figure, I see a couple different things. I see two line segments. So I see the line segment AC and BD. And I also see four right angles. Alright, so obviously you can see one right angle right there on the board already. Alright, so the other right angles I see that AE and ED make a right angle. I see that AE and EB make a right angle, so I'm going to draw that right there. And I see that BE and EC make a right angle, and that ECED make a right angle. So if you notice right here in the middle, I have four right angles, and it's represented by the four little squares. Alright, so a right angle, if you don't know, a right angle is an angle that measures 90 degrees. So that goes back to my standard that I'm using. Alright, so a right angle measures 90 degrees, and how we represent a right angle in a figure is that little square. So in this case, where I have four right angles, I have four little squares right dead in the center. Alright, so you might be wondering how these right angles turn into perpendicular lines. Well, a perpendicular line is two lines that intersect to make a right angle. Alright? So all it is, it's two lines that meet and then they make that right angle. So if I look right here, I said that AE, ED make a right angle, AE and EB make a right angle, and BE and EC make a right angle, and then the last one is ECED make a right angle. Alright? So they also form the perpendicular lines because a perpendicular line makes that right angle. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to put a couple examples on my board that shows if they're perpendicular or parallel lines. Alright? So, if I was to write this example, or draw it, I should say, let's see here. Alright, if you look on my board right here, you would see another example of a perpendicular line. All right, so I'm going to label these. All right, so you see right here, I'm going to put that down here. So you see right here, this figure is a perpendicular line because line segment AB and CD intersect to make that right angle right here. You would also notice that I could put a right angle on the other side. Okay, so in this figure, I have two right angles. So these two line segments form to make a perpendicular line, or two lines that intersect to make that right angle. What if I put this example on the board? Would this be an example of a perpendicular line? The answer is no. Because, yes, these two lines intersect, but they don't intersect to form a right angle. These angles in here, they're little angles. They're acute angles, so these are intersecting lines. And intersecting lines, just like what it sounds, is two lines that intersect, but they do not form right angles. So, indeed, they are not perpendicular lines. All right, so now that we kind of have a feel of what perpendicular lines are, and like an example of what a perpendicular line is and one that is not a perpendicular line, let's look at a figure to figure out some examples of perpendicular lines inside of a figure. So if I was to draw a rectangle on my board, and I'm going to label my rectangle, so I have A, B, C, and D. All right, so now what I'm going to do in this figure, I'm going to go through my steps on how I figure out which lines are perpendicular lines. And remember, a perpendicular line is just two lines that intersect to make a right angle. And a right angle is represented by a little square in the corner. All right? So if I look right here, you might be wondering how I can figure out if there is perpendicular lines in this picture because there are no squares to represent a right angle. That is true, but I'm going to make the squares today. Okay, so let's look right here. All right, so I know a perpendicular line is two lines that have to intersect to make a right angle. Well, if I look right here, I'm going to use a different color marker so you know you can see my work that I'm doing. So if I look right here, if I look at my line segment AB, and I'm trying to figure out a line that intersects it to make a right angle, okay? So if I'm looking at line segment AB, I'm going to look at line segment AC also. And those two cross right at the edge to make a right angle. I'm going to draw that a little better. Okay? So, line segments AB and AC intersect to make that right angle. Okay? The other example that deals with line segment AB is line segment BD. So line segments AB and BD intersect to make a right angle. All right, so you might be noticing these lines aren't crossing right in the middle, or they're not intersecting right in the middle like the two examples I gave you in the beginning. But that's okay because these lines are intersecting at some point in the line segment to make that right angle. Okay, so a perpendicular line doesn't have to necessarily just intersect in the middle to make it a perpendicular line. It can do it at the edge right here. That is totally fine. All right. Then if I look at line segment BD and line segment CD, those both intersect to make a right angle. Okay? And then the last right angle I see in this figure is line segments AC and line segment CD. They intersect to make a right angle. Okay? So I've went through all the right angles I see in this picture. So I've gone through my examples of my perpendicular lines. Okay? But now what I'm going to do is look at how I write these. Okay, so let's go with line segment AB. Okay, so I'm going to draw it down here. I'm going to draw my line segment AB, and remember how you draw a line segment is your 2 points that you use and the line above it. Okay, AB is perpendicular, and the symbol for perpendicular is an upside down capital T. So you have your vertical line and then a horizontal line, or your upside down T. Okay, and it's perpendicular to line segment BD. Okay, so I put my 2 points that I use and then my line segment symbol. Okay, then I also said AB, or line segment AB, is also perpendicular to AC, or line segment AC. All right, then line segment CD is perpendicular to line segment CA, and its line segment CD is also perpendicular to line segment BD. All right, so that's how, in this case, you draw or you represent the line or line segments being perpendicular to an example. All right, so now that we have gone over what a perpendicular line is, how we recognize them in a figure, and how we draw them, like the symbols, now we're going to switch gears and go into parallel lines. All right, so like I said, parallel and perpendicular lines are the opposite. So if perpendicular lines are two lines that intersect to form a right angle, what do you think a parallel line is? I'll give you a second. Okay, so parallel lines are two lines that never cross. No matter how long you extend the line, these two lines never cross, no matter how far you extend them. So let me do an example. All right, so if I was to give you the example right here, so I have line segment AB and line segment CD. These two lines are parallel because if I extend these lines in both directions, kind of have to forgive me, my diagonal lines are pretty bad. Okay, no matter how many or how far I extend both lines or line segments, they're never going to cross. So that's what a parallel line is. Parallel lines are lines that never cross. So these lines are never going to form any type of angle because they are never going to cross. So what if I give you this example? I have line segment AB and I have line segment CD. So these two line segments are not the same length, or they're not as long as each other. Are these lines parallel? I'll give you a second to think of your answer. All right, you are correct if you said no or yes. Sorry, yes, they are parallel lines. Because if I extend them in both directions, or both of them, they're never going to cross. So these are indeed parallel lines. All right, let's go through one more example to see if these are parallel lines. All right, I can't talk today. It's one of those days. I'm getting tongue-tied. All right, so if I give you this example, all right, is this an example of a parallel line? I'll give you a second to make your answer or take your answer. These are indeed not an example of parallel lines because if you notice right here, if I extend my lines in both directions, eventually these two are going to cross somewhere down here. So if my two lines cross, then this is not an example of a parallel line because parallel lines do not cross, or they do not intersect. So these are not an example of a parallel line. So let's do a familiar figure, or let me draw a familiar figure and discuss some examples of parallel lines. All right. So I'm going to draw my little rectangle, and I'm going to label my rectangle. All right. So if you notice with my example, I'll give you a second to look at the example of the figure I have on this board. There are two sets of parallel lines in this figure. Okay, so let's go over the two examples for the two sets of parallel lines. All right, so I'm going to start with my line segment AB. So I'm going to figure out what line or lines are parallel to line segment AB. Well, if you notice or you remember what a parallel line is, or what the definition of it is is two lines that never cross. So if I look at AB right here, I notice that CD is going to be parallel to them. All right? So I'm going to put my parallel symbol, and my parallel line symbol is just two vertical lines. Okay? So it's just two lines going up and down that represent the parallel symbol. Okay? And then I'm going to put line segment CD. Okay? Now, let's look at line segment AC. All right? Which line or lines are parallel to line segment AC? Well, if I'm looking at right here, a parallel line never crosses, so BD is going to be parallel to AC. So I'm going to put my parallel symbol right here, and then I'm going to do BD. All right? So those are my two sets of parallel lines. All right, so now you know what parallel lines are, you know how to identify them in a figure, and you know how to draw them using the parallel symbol. All right, so in this video, to recap what we did, we identified and drew parallel and perpendicular lines. Okay, so we determined what perpendicular lines are, which are two lines that intersect to form a right angle, which a right angle is 90 degrees, and it's represented by the little square in the corner. Then we learned what intersecting lines were, and just like what they sound like, they intersect, obviously. Then we looked at parallel lines, and parallel lines are two lines that never cross no matter how long you extend them in both directions. All right, so we were able to define what they were and look at a familiar figure and determine what are some examples. And then you learned that the symbol for perpendicular is the upside down capital T. So you have your vertical line and then your horizontal line at the end, like the bottom. And then you learned what the symbol for parallel was, two vertical lines. All right, I hope this video helped you guys with knowing the difference between perpendicular and parallel lines. Have a good day.